Okay, so you know that feeling right when you're like wading through a ton of info, maybe you're prepping for a big presentation or you're trying to like wrap your head around some new field, or maybe you're just, super curious about something
Mm-hmm.
and you want to get to those like key insights.
Yeah.
You want the stuff that really like clicks without having to go through all the tiny little detail.
Right, right. Like the stuff that really matters.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
So that's what we try to do here, right?
absolutely.
Welcome to the deep dive. Your shortcut to being like truly well informed about all sorts of things.
I love that shortcut to being well informed because sometimes you just don't have the time to read everything, right? You
Exactly.
need that like super distilled version.
Totally. And today we're looking at something that we talk about all the time, but maybe we don't always think about it super deeply.
Okay.
Curiosity and interest.
Oh, interesting.
Right? We use those words kind of like they're the same thing.
Mm.
But have you ever stopped to think, like, is there actually a difference?
I know it's something that I've definitely thought about, just casually, but I haven't like really dug into it.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to do today because we came across this research article that really got us thinking.
Oh, cool.
It's called How Are Curiosity and Interest Different? Naive Bayes' Classification of People's Beliefs.
Okay.
It's from Educational Psychology Review.
Catchy title.
Right. And it really made us wonder, are curiosity and interest like basically just two sides of the same coin? Or are they something totally different?
Yeah. Are they fundamentally different ways that we interact with the world and learn about things?
Yeah, exactly.
I like that.
So that's our mission today.
Okay,
We're
cool.
going to try to figure out what makes curiosity different from interest based on what this article found. And I think you'll be surprised by some of what we learned.
Okay. I'm ready to be surprised. Let's do it.
All right. So one of the first things the researchers point out is that even though there's been like tons of research on both curiosity and interest, there's not actually a ton of agreement on how to tell them apart.
Huh. Okay. So even the people who study this stuff, like, haven't quite figured out where the lines are.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. They were saying that there were times when people were just using the terms like as synonyms.
Wow. So, like, using curiosity and interest completely interchangeably?
Yeah, pretty much. And what's
Hmm.
interesting is that this isn't just some like academic debate,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
It actually matters like in the real world, especially when you think about education.
Okay. I can see that.
Like if curiosity and interest are actually leading to learning through different processes,
Yeah.
then how we try to like encourage those things in students could have totally different outcomes.
That makes a lot of sense. So, figuring out what makes them different could be really useful for teachers, for parents, anyone who's trying to help someone learn something.
Exactly.
You're not-
So the article talks about how they're basically like these two separate tracks of research.
Okay.
You've got people studying curiosity, and then you've got people studying interest. And it's almost like there are these two different fields that aren't really talking to each other, even though they're looking at pretty similar things.
Wow. So, like, two ships passing in the night, both interested in how we engage with the world, but not really connecting with each other.
Yeah, it's really strange. And within each of these fields, there are all these different ideas about how things work.
Okay.
So for both curiosity and interest, there's this idea of state versus trait.
Right. Like, are we talking about a fleeting feeling or a more lasting tendency?
Exactly. So a state would be like a momentary feeling of curiosity or interest,
Okay.
and a trait would be like a general tendency to be curious or interested.
Okay. That makes sense.
So for curiosity specifically, you have ideas like the information gap theory.
Okay. I've heard of that one. What is that again?
It basically says that we become curious when we realize there's something we don't know and we want to fill that gap.
Okay. Yeah, that makes intuitive sense, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's a hole in my knowledge and it's kind of bugging me, so I want to fill it in.
Exactly. Okay. And then there's the distinction between what they call I-type curiosity and D-type curiosity.
Okay, so two types of curiosity, I type and D type. What's the difference there?
So I-type is more about the enjoyment of learning and discovering new things. It's like that, that's cool, I want to learn more kind of feeling.
Okay, so that's more like leisurely curiosity. You're just enjoying the process of finding out new stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And then D-type curiosity is more like urgent. It's that I need to know this right now kind of
Yeah.
feeling.
Okay, so that's more like when you're driven by a specific question or a problem that you need to solve.
Right, exactly. It's like a really strong urge to get that missing information.
Gotcha. So those are some of the ideas on the curiosity side. What about on the interest side?
So with interest, they talk about situational interest, which is triggered by something specific in your environment.
Okay, so like if I see a cool poster about a lecture that sparks my interest.
Exactly. And then there's individual interest, which is more about your personal preferences
Yeah.
and what you're drawn to in general.
Gotcha. So that's more like my long-standing love of a particular topic or hobby.
Right. And they even have this four-stage model that describes how interest can develop over time.
Oh, wow. So they've really mapped out the whole life cycle of interest. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And when you look at all of this, it's clear that both curiosity and interest are super complex.
Yeah, definitely.
But the big question is still like, in that moment, when you're feeling curious or interested, what's actually different about what's happening in your brain?
Right. Like, what's the difference in how we're experiencing those two things?
Yeah, and this article really digs into that.
Okay, awesome.
They focus on the distinctions at that immediate, like, state level.
Got it. So we're getting into the nitty-gritty here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about the key differences.
Okay, let's do it.
The first thing they look at is what might trigger those feelings of curiosity or interest.
Okay, the sparks that get the whole thing going.
Right, so the idea is that curiosity might be triggered by things that are kind of unexpected.
Okay, like something surprised.
Like novelty, complexity, things that surprise you or make you feel uncertain.
Gotcha.
They call these collative variables.
Collative variables. Huh. I haven't heard that term before.
It's a mouthful,
It is.
but it basically means like things that catch your attention
Yeah.
because they're different from what you're used to.
Okay, so it's like something that deviates from the norm and makes you go, wait a minute, what's going on here?
Yeah, exactly. So,
Yeah.
like, imagine you see a picture that has a weird optical illusion in it.
Okay, yeah, I can see that.
That incongruity,
Yeah.
like the fact that it doesn't make sense, might make you curious to figure out, like, how does that work?
Right, like why am I seeing that? What's tricking my brain?
Exactly.
Okay, so those kinds of things might trigger curiosity. What about interest? What sparks that?
So, interest, they think, has, like, broader triggers.
Okay, so not just the unexpected stuff.
Right. It could be something you find personally relevant, or maybe you get positive feedback about something.
Okay, so it's like something that connects with you on a personal level or that you've had a good experience with before.
Yeah. Or it could involve a social element, like maybe your friends are all interested in something, so you become interested too.
Okay, so it can be influenced by the people around us.
Right. Or it could be as simple as the information being presented in a really clear and engaging way.
Okay, so if something is well organized and easy to understand, that could make it more interesting.
Exactly. But here's the thing. The study actually found that there wasn't really strong agreement on these different triggers.
Oh, interesting. So it sounds like there's still a lot we don't know about what specifically sparks curiosity versus interest.
Yeah, it seems like that's an area where more research is needed.
Okay, so a bit of a mystery still.
Totally. Okay, so moving on to the next difference. This is where it gets really interesting.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
So it has to do with how we actually seek out information when we're feeling curious or interested.
Okay, so like what do we do when we're driven by curiosity versus interest?
Exactly. So the idea is that when we're curious, our information seeking is very focused.
Okay, like we're on a mission.
Right? We've identified a very specific gap in our knowledge.
Okay.
And once we fill that gap, the curiosity tends to go away.
So it's like I have this one question and I'm going to keep searching until I find the answer and then I'm done.
Exactly. It's very goal-oriented.
Gotcha.
And they link this back to that D-type curiosity. Remember that feeling of, I need to know this right now.
Right, that urgent kind of curiosity.
Yeah, so that's often driving this very focused information seeking.
Okay, makes sense. So what about interest? How is information seeking different when we're driven by interest?
So interest is thought to be more about like broader engagement with a topic.
Okay, so less about finding one specific answer.
Right, you might just keep exploring and learning more because you're enjoying it.
Okay, so it's more about the journey than the destination.
Exactly. And because the goal is ongoing engagement rather than just answering a specific question, these states of interest might last much longer.
Okay, that makes sense. If you're just enjoying the process of learning and exploring, you're not going to stop as soon as you find one answer. You're going to keep going.
Exactly. Thinking about it, I can definitely remember times when I've like frantically searched for a specific answer to something
Yes, totally.
versus times when I've like happily fallen down a rabbit hole of information about something I was interested in.
Yeah, totally. Like, I get that too. It's like the difference between needing to know what year a particular battle happened versus spending hours reading about the entire history of a war.
Yeah, perfect example. Okay, so the third proposed difference has to do with our knowledge state before we become curious or interested.
Okay, so like what we already know or don't know before the curiosity or interest kicks in.
Right, so there's this idea related to curiosity called the inverted U-shaped curve.
Okay, inverted U-shaped curve. That sounds kind of complicated.
It's not too bad.
Yeah.
Basically, it says that our curiosity is highest when we know a little bit about something but not everything.
Okay, so there's like a sweet spot of knowledge where curiosity peaks.
It's exact.
Okay, I'm following you.
So if we know absolutely nothing about something, we might not be that curious.
Okay, that's interesting. So like if I'm completely clueless about a topic, I might not even be curious enough to start learning about it.
Yeah, and if we think we already know everything about something, we also might not be that curious.
Okay, so too little knowledge or too much knowledge can both squash curiosity?
Right. It's like there needs to be that perfect balance of knowing enough to be intrigued, but not so much that you think you already have all the answers.
Okay, I can see that. Can you give me an example of how that plays out in the real world?
Sure. So imagine you're reading about like a really complex scientific topic that you've never heard of before.
Okay.
You might feel kind of overwhelmed and not really be that curious about all the details right away.
Yeah, because it's all so new and foreign.
Right. But if you learn like a few basic principles, you might start to wonder how those principles connect or what the implications are.
Okay, yeah, and that's where the curiosity would kick in. Okay, so that makes sense. What about interest? Does it follow a similar pattern?
So interest doesn't necessarily follow that curve,
Okay, so it's not as dependent on how much you already know.
right? You can be super interested in something that you already know a lot about.
Okay, yeah, I can definitely relate to that. Like, the more I learn about something I'm interested in, the more interested I become.
Exactly. And in fact, that existing knowledge often fuels further interest.
Right, it's like each new thing you learn opens up more avenues for exploration.
Exactly. And the article brings up that distinction between I-type and D-type curiosity again here.
Okay, how does that fit in?
So they're saying that that don't know feeling might be more connected to I-type curiosity, that general desire to learn and explore.
Okay.
Well, that tip of the tongue feeling where you almost know something but you can't quite remember it,
Right.
that might be more linked to D-type, that urgent need to know.
Okay, so I-type is more about exploring the unknown, while D-type is more about filling in specific gaps in our existing knowledge.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. But overall, the study found that the consensus seems to be that curiosity involves not knowing and wanting new information,
Okay.
whereas interest is more connected to already knowing something.
Okay, so curiosity is about venturing into new territory, while interest is about delving deeper into familiar territory.
Exactly. Okay, let's move on to emotions or affect, as they call it in the article.
Okay, emotions. How do those play into curiosity and interest?
So the theory is that curiosity might initially feel kind of negative,
Oh, interesting. Negative in what way?
like that feeling of, I don't know this and maybe I should.
Okay, yeah, I can see that it's like there's a sense of lack or deprivation almost.
Right, exactly. But then once we find the answer and that feeling of deprivation goes away, it becomes positive.
Okay, so it's like an itch that needs to be scratched, and once it's scratched, you feel relief and satisfaction.
Exactly.
Makes sense. What about interest? Is that also initially negative?
So interest, they think, is generally positive from the start.
Okay, so it's more like a feeling of enjoyment or fascination right from the get-go.
Right. And they connect this back to the I and D types of curiosity again.
Okay, how so?
They're saying that D-type curiosity, because it's that urgent need to know,
Yeah.
might be linked to more negative feelings initially.
Okay, yeah, because it's like a problem that needs to be solved.
Right. And then I-type curiosity, which is more about the enjoyment of learning, would be associated with positive feelings from the start.
Gotcha. So D-type is driven by a need, while I-type is driven by a desire.
Exactly. But the study found that while people generally agreed that interest is pleasurable, the idea that curiosity starts off negative and then becomes positive wasn't as strongly supported.
Interesting. So maybe the emotional side of curiosity is a bit more complex than we initially thought.
Yeah, it seems like there's more to unpack there. Okay, last one.
Hit me with it.
This one's a little bit more technical.
Okay, I'm ready.
It's called incentive salience.
Okay, break that down for me.
So it has to do with the difference between wanting something and liking something.
Okay, I think I can wrap my head around that distinction.
Okay, so wanting involves dopamine.
Okay, the neurotransmitter associated with reward and motivation.
Right. And liking involves opioids.
Okay, the neurotransmitters associated with pleasure and enjoyment.
Exactly. So the idea is that D-type curiosity, that urgent need to know, might involve a stronger sense of wanting.
Okay, so it's like, I really want to know the answer, even if the answer itself might not be particularly pleasant or enjoyable.
Yeah, exactly. Like, think about scrolling endlessly through social media.
Oh, yeah, I can relate to that.
Sometimes the want to see what's next is so strong that it kind of overrides whether you're actually enjoying what you're seeing or whether it's even good for you.
Right, it's like that feeling of, I just have to know what happens next, even if it's something I know I'm going to regret later.
Exactly. So the study didn't find a clear consensus on this wanting versus liking distinction in terms of curiosity and interest.
Okay, so maybe that's something that needs further investigation.
Yeah. But they did find a link between curiosity and potentially bad outcomes,
Oh, interesting. Like what kind of bad outcomes?
like pursuing information that might be harmful or upsetting even.
Okay, so curiosity can sometimes lead us down dangerous paths.
Yeah, seems like it.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. It's clear that there are all these different theories about how curiosity and interest work. But how do researchers actually study these things in a way that's like reliable and unbiased?
That's a great question, and the article points out that a lot of the previous research has used what they call top-down approaches.
Okay, top down, what does that mean?
It means that researchers start with a specific theory about curiosity and interest,
Mm-hmm.
and then they design studies to see if that theory holds up.
Okay, so they have a preconceived notion and then they look for evidence to support it.
Yeah, and the problem with that is that the findings can be influenced by the researcher's initial assumptions.
Right, so their own biases might be shaping the results.
Exactly.
Okay, so what's the alternative to a top-down approach?
So there's also what they call bottom-up approaches.
Okay, bottom up. Tell me more about that.
So with a bottom-up approach, researchers might give people a bunch of questions about their experiences with curiosity and interest,
Okay.
and then they see if the responses tend to cluster together in meaningful ways.
Okay, so they're looking for patterns in the data without imposing their own theories beforehand.
Right. But even with these bottom-up approaches, there can still be some bias in how the researchers interpret the data.
Okay, I see. So there's always a risk of researchers influencing the results even if they're trying to be objective.
Exactly. And that's what's so cool about the approach this study took.
Okay, tell me about it.
They wanted to understand how people think about curiosity and interest without imposing any pre-existing scientific theories.
Okay, so a truly bottom-up approach.
Yeah, they wanted to see what the consensus view was, like, what do people generally agree on?
Okay, that's a really interesting approach. How did they do that?
So they asked a huge group of people who weren't experts in the field to just define curiosity and interest in their own words.
Okay, so they got a bunch of everyday definitions from regular people.
Exactly. And then they used machine learning to analyze those definitions.
Machine learning, wow, that's pretty high tech.
It is. They use something called a naive Bayes classifier.
Naive Bayes classifier. Okay, I'm not super familiar with machine learning. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so basically it's like a super smart detective
Okay.
that looks at all the words people used in their definitions and figures out which words are most likely to show up when they're talking about curiosity versus interest.
Okay, so it can identify the words that are most strongly associated with each concept.
Exactly. And it does this without any researcher bias because it's all based on the data itself.
Wow, so it's like a purely data-driven approach that eliminates the risk of human interpretation skewing the results.
Yeah, exactly. And the results of the first study were really amazing.
Okay, tell me what they found.
So the classifier was super successful at telling the difference between the definitions of curiosity and interest.
Wow. So that suggests that there is a shared understanding among regular people about how these two things are different.
Exactly. And what's really insightful is the specific words that the classifier used to make those distinctions.
Okay, so what words were most strongly linked to interest?
So for interest, the words that stood out were hobby, spend, time, and subject.
Okay, so words that suggest personal investment and a focus on a particular topic over time.
Right, exactly. It really supports that idea that interest is about a longer-term engagement with something you choose to dedicate yourself to.
Yeah, it's about things that we're passionate about, things we want to spend our time on.
Exactly. And what about curiosity? What words stood out there?
Hmm.
So for curiosity, there was a different set of words: world, around, us, human, nature, children, anim, and then a lot of action-oriented words like ask, question, explore, see, answer, inform, understand, desire, status.
Okay, so words that suggest a more active and outward-focused pursuit of knowledge.
Right. And there were also words suggesting novelty like new and don't know.
Okay, so curiosity seems to be linked to a desire for new information, things we haven't encountered before.
Exactly. And even the word bad popped up, which is kind of interesting.
Bad, huh? That's unexpected. What do you think that means?
Maybe it's related to that idea that curiosity can sometimes lead us to pursue information that might not be good for us.
Oh, right. Like that thing we were talking about earlier about how the wanting aspect of curiosity can sometimes override our better judgment.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also worth noting the words that didn't really help the classifier distinguish between curiosity and interest.
Okay, so words that were common to both definitions.
Right? Words like can, want, thing, feel, knowledge, and topic.
Okay, so these are aspects that are probably shared by both curiosity and interest.
Yeah, exactly. And when they asked the participants how similar they thought the two terms were, most people said somewhat similar, somewhat different.
Okay, so people recognize that there's overlap, but also some key distinctions.
Exactly. Okay, so now for the second study, this is where it gets really cool.
Okay, I'm ready for the next level.
So they took the classifier that they had trained on all those regular people's definitions,
Okay.
and they used it to analyze definitions provided by experts,
Experts like who?
psychologists and neuroscientists, who actually study curiosity and interest.
Wow, so they're seeing if the expert definitions match up with the everyday understanding of these terms.
Exactly. And the results were super interesting.
Okay, tell me what they found.
So the classifier that was trained on everyday language was actually really good at classifying the expert definitions too.
Wow, so that suggests that the experts generally align with the way regular people think about curiosity and interest.
Exactly. And they even found that the classifier was more accurate for experts who had published more on curiosity and interest.
Okay, so the more an expert knows about these topics, the more likely their definition is to align with the common understanding.
Right. But it was less accurate when trying to classify curiosity definitions from experts whose main area of research was interest.
Huh. That's kind of counterintuitive. You'd think that someone who studies interest would have a good grasp of curiosity as well.
Yeah, it is kind of strange. And interestingly, the experts were less inclined than the non-experts to say that the two terms were mostly similar.
Okay, so maybe the experts are more attuned to the subtle nuances that distinguish curiosity from interest.
Yeah, maybe. And another interesting finding was that the classifier wasn't quite as good at classifying the expert definitions of curiosity compared to their definitions of interest.
Huh. So maybe interest is a bit easier to define than curiosity.
Yeah, maybe. Or maybe it's just that our understanding of curiosity is still evolving.
That's a good point. There's still a lot we don't know about these things.
Totally. So if we take all of this together, what's the takeaway?
Yeah, what's the big picture here?
So the core consensus seems to be this curiosity is about actively seeking out specific new information.
Okay.
It's about filling a particular gap in your knowledge.
Okay, so it's driven by a need to know.
Right.
Okay, what about interest?
Interest is more about a pleasurable, in-depth engagement with subjects you already have some familiarity with.
Okay, so it's more about exploring and deepening your existing knowledge.
Exactly.
So both are about learning, but they have different motivations and goals.
Right. And it's important to remember that both involve a desire to know motivation and ultimately the acquisition of knowledge.
Yeah, they're both fundamental to how we learn and grow.
Totally. So what does this mean for us? What are the implications of this research?
Yeah, that's the key question, right? How can we use this knowledge?
So the researchers argue that this consensus view provides a really valuable foundation for future research.
Okay, so it gives us a solid starting point for further exploration.
Exactly. And it could also influence how we design future studies.
Okay, how so?
So, for example, researchers could try to develop tasks that are specifically designed to trigger either curiosity or interest.
Okay, so based on this common understanding of what makes them different.
Exactly. And then they could examine how those different states affect things, like how well people remember information.
Okay, that's fascinating. So we could start to understand the unique effects of curiosity versus interest on learning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it could also lead to the development of better ways to measure these states.
Okay, that makes sense. If we understand how people think about curiosity and interest, we can ask them better questions about it.
Right. And that could be really useful in fields like education.
Yeah, totally. If we understand how students think about curiosity and interest, we can design better teaching strategies.
Exactly. So for someone who's trying to design a lesson plan, for example,
Yeah.
how could they use this knowledge to spark curiosity and interest in their students?
That's a great question. So, based on this research, one approach could be to start the lesson with something surprising or puzzling.
Okay, so something that would trigger that initial curiosity.
Exactly, like a surprising fact or a weird image, something that doesn't quite make sense. And then once you've got their attention, you could connect that to broader themes or allow students to explore aspects of the topic that are particularly relevant to them.
Okay, so start with something that sparks curiosity and then transition to something that fosters sustained interest.
Exactly that way. You're tapping into both of those powerful learning mechanisms.
Awesome. Of course, the study authors do point out some limitations.
Okay, what are those?
So some of the specific words that the classifier used to distinguish between the definitions weren't totally clear in their meaning on their own.
Okay, so there's some ambiguity there.
Yeah, and also the method they used might be a bit more sensitive to trait level differences rather than those fleeting moment-to-moment experiences of curiosity and interest.
Right, so it might be capturing more of our general tendencies to be curious or interested rather than those specific instances where those feelings arise.
Exactly. And they also suggest some exciting directions for future research.
Okay, like what?
So they mentioned things like conducting more in-depth qualitative studies.
Okay, so going beyond the quantitative data and getting a richer understanding of people's experiences
Exactly. And using more advanced text analysis techniques.
to really dig into the nuances of language.
Right. And they emphasize the importance of really focusing on those state-level distinctions between curiosity and interest.
Okay, so really trying to understand what's happening in the brain in those specific moments when we're feeling curious or interested.
Exactly. So what do you think are the key takeaways for our listeners?
Yeah, what should people walk away from this deep dive thinking about?
So I think the main takeaway is that while we often use curiosity and interest almost interchangeably, they actually represent different ways we engage with information.
Yeah, that's a really important point. They're not just synonyms.
Right. Curiosity is that active itch to know something specific and new.
Yeah.
It's about uncovering something.
And it's often driven by a sense of urgency, like we need to know the answer right now.
Exactly. Whereas interest is more about a deeper, more enjoyable engagement with areas you already have some connection with.
Right, it's about the things that really capture our attention and hold it over time.
Exactly. And it's often accompanied by a sense of pleasure and fascination.
Yeah, it's like we're drawn to these things because they're inherently interesting to us.
Exactly. So I think it's worth taking a moment to reflect on your own experiences.
Yeah, think about those times when you've felt that urgent need to know something versus those times when you've happily spent hours exploring a topic that just fascinates you.
Do these distinctions ring true for you?
And what new questions does this deep dive raise for you? What are you curious to explore further?
Those are some things to ponder.
Definitely food for thought.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into curiosity and interest.
Absolutely my pleasure.
And be sure to check back next time for another deep dive into some fascinating topic.
Until then, keep those minds curious and interested. See you later.